I welcome everyone to the first Department of Homeland Security Subcommittee hearing with the Federal Emergency Management Agency of the 116th Congress. I especially welcome Mr. Gaynor. I believe this is your first hearing as acting administrator, so welcome. This subcommittee has a long bipartisan tradition, and emergency management issues are a prime principle as to why. Disasters do not distinguish where they strike by party affiliation, and helping disaster survivors and their communities in the wake of a disaster is a goal we all share. Most of the members of this subcommittee come from states that are frequently struck by disasters. My home state of California is a prime example. Our state has been struck by catastrophic and deadly wildfires and now is being affected by rains and floods that can be devastating, especially in the burned areas. We greatly appreciate FEMA's efforts to help disaster survivors and their communities in California. FEMA has a demanding job. Congress has given FEMA very broad and flexible authority and a difficult mission. We ask FEMA to help people and communities prepare for, respond to, and recover from some of the worst days they will ever face. FEMA employees do this frequently and with long periods away from home and family. We fully recognize that no matter how many times FEMA does amazing things, it is usually the things that don't go well that get reported in the media and to members of Congress. While this subcommittee is very supportive of FEMA, its employees, and its mission, that does not abrogate our responsibility for vigorous oversight. During this hearing, as we work with you going forward, we intend to ask tough questions. This is not to make things more difficult, but to ensure we are fully informed as part of our responsibility to see that FEMA carries out its mission in a fast, efficient, and effective manner. Next month, members of the subcommittee and the Subcommittee on Transportation and Housing and Urban Development will travel to Puerto Rico to see firsthand how recovery efforts are faring. Well, that will be the focus of our trip. It is not the exclusive focus of this hearing or our oversight activities. I would be remiss if I did not convey our thoughts and concerns to those impacted by the recent tornadoes in the Southeast, especially in Alabama. Mr. Gaynor, I understand you were recently there and that your colleagues at FEMA have been working with state and local partners in response to these disasters. We look forward to your assessment of the situation during this hearing. Again, thank you for appearing before the subcommittee today, and now I'll turn to my colleague, Ranking Member Fleischman, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to thank you and let everyone know on both sides of the aisle that Ms. Robel-Allard, it has been an honor working with you in your capacity as chairman. I'm the ranking member, but we've had several visits so far, and I appreciate the way that things are going so far. Thank you very much. Mr. Gaynor, thank you for joining us today. I represent the people of the 3rd District of Tennessee, Chattanooga, all the way up to the Kentucky border. And in my tenure in Congress, FEMA has done an outstanding job in dealing with the disasters. We've had tornadoes, now we're going through floods, but FEMA has always answered the call, and I want to thank you on behalf of my constituents. Whenever a disaster hits one of our communities, sir, we all hope that FEMA and the first local responders will be on the scene to bring a sense of order and safety to the chaos. And then with the rebuilding, a process that can take months, in some cases even years, we look to FEMA and your partner agencies. We devote a lot of money to recovery and rebuilding, sir, and we expect FEMA to show communities and states the way to get up and running. We expect a lot, the communities expect a lot, but we also expect FEMA to be good stewards of the billions of taxpayer dollars we provide every year. We are looking forward to hear that FEMA did both, effectively and efficiently, helped communities out of the worst thing that could have happened, got them back on their feet, and can say to the taxpayers and the Congress, we were good stewards of the funds. I look forward to your testimony, sir, and I thank you again for being here today. And Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Before we begin with the testimony, a few housekeeping items. The order in which members will be called for questioning will be based on the seniority of those who were present when the hearing was called to order, alternating between majority and minority members. Also, to ensure everyone has ample opportunity to ask questions, I would ask each member to keep their turn to the allotted 5 minutes per round. So, Mr. Gaynor, we look forward to your testimony, and we'll submit the full text of your testimony for the record.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairwoman Royal Allard and Ranking Member Fleischman and members of the committee. My name is Pete Gaynor, and I'm the Acting Administrator of FEMA. And on behalf of Secretary Nielsen and the administration, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to provide this committee with an update on the 2018 and 2017 disaster recovery efforts. The United States experienced 6 major hurricanes and 5 historic wildfires across these 2 years. Between January 2017 and December 2018, the President approved 143 major disaster and emergency declarations. Additionally, FEMA supported 202 fire management assistance grants. These 2 disaster seasons were significant in their devastation of life and property, as well as the cost to the affected communities and taxpayers. Specifically in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, we faced many unique challenges throughout the long-term recovery process. FEMA supports the Governor's Recovery Plan and will work to continue with our partners in Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, other federal agencies, and with Congress to find strategic solutions. After working closely for several months, I am pleased to announce that FEMA and the government of Puerto Rico came to an agreement last week on the government's financial control plan. The government of Puerto Rico has certified that they have the required fiscal controls, accounting procedures, and project administration in place to assume responsibility to facilitate their financial recovery or disaster recovery. We have found that success in emergency and response and recovery demands a response that is locally executed, state-managed, and federally supported. We must work with state and territorial governments to ensure that they are planning and budgeting for emergencies now and building the necessary capability to handle such disasters. We continue to support recovery efforts from Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, and Wilma nearly 14 years ago. FEMA and our partners recognize that this legacy recovery model is no longer acceptable and fiscally unsound. We will continue to work deliberately and methodically to ensure the outcome of any recoveries is to build a more resilient and prepared nation. A cultural shift towards outcome-driven recovery was a recommendation from FEMA's 2017 After Action Report. We are working hard to meet those findings and make all necessary improvements to our internal processes. This unprecedented scale, rapid succession, and intensity of disaster in recent years has stretched response recovery capabilities across the whole emergency management community to include our private sector and voluntary partners. It will take unity of effort across this community to ensure we are prepared and able to help people before, during, and after disasters. FEMA helps build capacity through providing preparedness and other grant programs to support our citizens and first responders. Such efforts are critical in allowing states and local governments to focus on small disasters, while FEMA focuses on catastrophic disaster response. 80% of all declared disasters incur obligations of $41 million or less, while 50% of all disasters cost less than $7 million. Aligned with the key focus areas in the After Action Report, FEMA's 2018 to 2022 strategic plan was published 1 year ago this week. This plan builds on best practices and identifies new initiatives geared towards our mission through achieving 3 overarching goals: build a culture of preparedness, ready the nation for catastrophic disasters, and reduce the complexity of FEMA. As part of our goal of readying the nation for catastrophic disasters, FEMA took the initiative to update the National Response Framework. This rewrite focuses on the stabilization of critical lifelines and coordination across infrastructure sectors. Lifelines provide an indispensable service that enable key businesses and government functions that, if not properly restored, could risk the health and safety of communities impacted by disasters. FEMA continues to build a culture of preparedness by focusing on pre-disaster mitigation to build resilient communities. In 2018, Congress took significant steps to support this effort with the passage of the Disaster Recovery Reform Act. This is transformational legislation, will assist the nation in reducing risk and increasing preparedness in a more meaningful and tangible way. Thank you for support in passing this bill. I look forward to our continued partnership and support from this committee, and we will continue to meet the disaster needs of the nation and ultimately help people in their time of greatest need. So thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Gaynor. I'd like to begin by asking a couple of questions with regards to what's happening in California. It's my understanding that there are several residents in my home state that were impacted by the 2017 Tubbs wildfires who are still not back in their homes and are approaching FEMA's 18-month limit on temporary housing assistance. What is FEMA doing, or what can it do, to help survivors who have been unable to rebuild within the time frame allowed by FEMA's Housing Assistance Program?
Yes, ma'am. So just as background, I think post-disaster housing for this country is a big problem, and I think it's even more problematic in locations where wildfires occurred, and especially in the most recent wildfires in Butte County. I don't think FEMA will ever be able to deliver all the post-disaster housing needs that may be incurred in a disaster. And this is where we need partnership from states and locals to help us deliver that housing disaster requirement. You know, I spent almost 10 years as a local emergency management director and a state director, and I think the solution is not for the federal government to say, this is the housing solution that we place upon you, but to have the local and state governments develop their unique housing needs, and we'll help meet those needs with federal support. So the specifics of your question, I don't know all the details, but I'll find out if there's a hang-up in that. I'll be happy to follow up with your staff.
Okay, would appreciate that.
Thank you, ma'am.
Also, Mr. Gaynor, California, including Los Angeles, has been struck by devastating wildfires over the last 2 years, as we've discussed. Wildfires are sometimes only the first part of a disaster cycle that can later include flooding and mudslides with heavy rainfalls on the burned areas. In fact, I understand from emergency managers back home that there have been recent evacuations in California due to flooding in these previously burned areas. The recently enacted Disaster Recovery Reform Act provided FEMA additional authority to mitigate these risks. Can you provide an update on the situation in California, steps FEMA and the state are taking to mitigate against the occurrence of future wildfires, floods, and mudslides, and how
The Dura section about post-disaster or hazard mitigation post-fire. So the new authority gives us the ability to add specifically to FMAGs a post-disaster mitigation to that. I think what else is what we love about Dura is it also tags on. We also passed some laws to improve, you know, the reduction of biomass and trees in the forest to again reduce that fire risk. I think we're all in sync about pre-disaster mitigation, and from our point of view, we rather invest in pre-disaster mitigation than pay that bill after. It's all tied together with landslides and mudslides. It's really management of this risk is really what's at the heart of this. But I think now with funding from Dura, the much better shape to address that problem.
Okay. And just quickly in the time I have left, I mentioned in my statement what was happening in Alabama, that you had recently visited there. Can you provide an update on what you saw and how FEMA is assisting disaster survivors and their communities?
Yes, ma'am. So I had the great honor to fly down with the President and the Secretary on Friday. Senator Shelby and Rep. Rogers accompanied us down there. Lee County impacted by a EF4 tornado, 170 miles an hour winds. I actually had never been to a tornado of that scale ever. And if you can just imagine taking your house, the contents of your house, your clothes, your car, your trees, everything that you own, times 300 of your neighbors and put it all into a blender and then pouring it back out on the earth, that's what this place looked like. Pretty devastating. And so we have, the President signed emergency major declaration for Lee County, and within a couple hours we had about 171 FEMA employees down there trying to deliver assistance to those survivors. Very devastating tornado. And that was just one of 6 or 7 tornadoes that touched down between Alabama and Georgia that day, or early that week.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And again, Administrator Gaynor, congratulations on your appointment. We look forward to working with you, sir. Acting Administrator Gaynor, as you've probably heard, many counties in Tennessee, my home state, have been hit hard in recent weeks with historic levels of with historic levels of flooding. In some neighborhoods in Hamilton County, my home county, the floodwaters continued to rise as recently as last week. In response, several counties in Tennessee are applying for grants from FEMA to mitigate the impact of this disaster, and our governor, Bill Lee, is closely evaluating the situation to determine the strain on state resources. In cases where the governor, working with state and local officials, determines that more help is needed, can you describe the process FEMA utilizes to make a recommendation concerning a presidential disaster declaration?
Yes, sir. And I'll just use my experience as a local and state director. What usually happens after disaster, there's a series of data collection to see what amount of disaster is actually out there. They call them preliminary damage assessments. So it's a team of local, state, and federal partners going out there to assess damage. From that, the state or the county or the local will write a request for disaster assistance. The governor and the state's emergency manager will probably evaluate that to see if it stands up to the law and on merit. And then the governor has the discretion to forward that to the president for action. It comes through the FEMA region, so the FEMA region responsible for Tennessee will look at it, and they'll forward it to FEMA headquarters. We'll evaluate it again, and then ultimately we send it to the president for disposition.
Thank you, sir. Is the process more challenging when the damage is more spread out and not concentrated?
It's challenging in trying to, tally up what's damaged and what's private, what's public, what has insurance, what doesn't have insurance. All those things go into it, economic factors. So it really depends on the uniqueness of the location. But I'm sure the emergency management director in Tennessee has been through this a few times. We offer technical assistance if there's any problems trying to assess the status of their initial assessments.
My final question on this part, sir, is are there steps that the agency can take to reduce the holding period and expedite the process, sir?
The holding period as in relation to?
I guess the holding period in regard to on your all side.
It typically doesn't take too long, and I'll just use the Alabama. I think within a few days the president approved it. So again, not every disaster is equal. They're all unique in its own way. Some take more because they're more complicated. Some are pretty straightforward and gets a little faster.
Yes, sir. Mr. Gaynor, last week this subcommittee heard from the Acting Inspector General, Mr. Kelly, on a number of topics across the department, including FEMA. When I asked the IG what questions we should include in today's hearing with FEMA in the 2017 and 2018 disasters, he did not pause when answering, asked them to compare their response and recovery rate to other disasters and see if their metrics for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands compare favorably to other disasters they have dealt with. So I ask you, sir, how do your metrics compare to Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands? And should I assume from Mr. Kelly's response that the numbers were not good?
I can't reference if there's a report or some document that Mr. Kelly's talking about, but I can say in what I do know about the scale of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, Hurricane Maria, it is a disaster, the scale that we've really never seen. And it is not your typical disaster. It is complicated. It's obviously on an island. There are lots of thorny issues that predated the disaster that we're trying to work through. It is one of our biggest risks, I think, for FEMA. We are all in with the government of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. We have committed a major part of our resources at FEMA to be on the island, advising them. So it is at the far end of the scale when it comes to complexity and recovery.
Thank you, sir. Madam Chairman, I'll yield back.
Thank you for being here, and we know you have a very difficult job, and we're just here to help you out, give you oversight, and ask you some questions. So, first thing, I want to talk about the last 2 years. The 2017 Atlantic hurricane season, I know, caused 3,300 fatalities. You know, we had 2018, the wildfires, and killed 100 people, and you know, I know how much time that you spent on that. But I want to talk about, and I guess we're getting a little parochial here, but that's who we represent, the area, and I represent the state of Maryland, the Port of Baltimore, and I have a lot of water in my district also. But I want to talk to you about the issue of the grant program, and it's which is really important. I think my district, Port of Baltimore, but every port I think in the nation. And FEMA's Port Security Grant Program is a lifeline to both large and small seaports across the country. And for this reason, I was discouraged at the administration's deficient funding request at $36 million for this federal assistance program. Now, this program was included in the original Department of Homeland Security authorization and was funded at $100 million, which a cut from $100 million to 36 in the recently passed minibus. And this is a clear evidence that Congress recognizes the need to secure our ports. Now, each year, America's ports generate about $4.6 trillion in revenue and employ over 23 million people throughout the country. And the Port of Baltimore, which I represent alone, generates $310 million in state, county, and municipal tax revenues, and that's not including all the other amount of monies that it's one of the biggest employers in our state and a lot of other states. Now, with the expansion of the Panama Canal, which are a lot larger ships, you know, coming in, we can only expect to see an increase in containers moving in and out of our country, especially the East Coast. The bottom line is that the economic impact of seaports cannot be understated, and according to the Brookings Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence, it would only take a small attack on our ports to grind U.S. commerce to a halt within days. I think we saw that in the L.A. port strike years ago. Thus, the need for port security cannot be understated. So for this reason, I feel strongly that we need to protect our maritime infrastructure. And my question, do you believe the Port Security Grant Program has been a valuable tool in combating terrorism and drugs and building infrastructure resiliency? Secondly, I can say the Port of Baltimore, which received about $1.18 million in 2017, they put these federal dollars to use improving their cybersecurity and upgrading their physical access points. And finally, to me, a cut in this program implies the ports have shored up all of their vulnerabilities, which they have not. So basically the question, you know, what is, do you feel that it is a valuable tool? What's the status? Where are we? And we're going to look at this issue on our committee.
Yes, sir. And I'm going to go back to my time as a local emergency manager in the city of Providence. We had a port, and I was.
Is that why you talk a little bit differently than?
I think I talk
teasing.
perfectly fine for me, sir. It sounds perfectly logical.
Boston, more the Boston type.
So I was a recipient of port grants, and I know how important those can be to any port. I think if you go back to 9/11 and drew a line on non-disaster grants, especially in Homeland Security grants, there's been a steady decline in funding over those years. I do think that the port grant is a valuable tool to all ports. There is a great demand on Homeland Security grants. Ports are one of those risks in a big portfolio. I was not part of determining how much each grant got, really above my pay grade, but it is an important tool for states, locals, ports to buy down their risk and be more resilient. I'll be happy to look into the status of the current grant year, where we are on that. And it is a competitive grant, so the better program that you put forth, the better results you'll yield on the far end. So,
and we know, the drug issue we have now. I think the majority of our ports, a lot of the fentanyl from China is coming in through the ports. And you know how many people are dying every day in our country? Hundreds and hundreds. Thank you.
I'll be happy to follow up on the number
Thank you.
part.
Okay, good. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to talk a little bit about the federal contracting regulations versus state and local. And just to give you an idea of some of the problems that that's created, including the reimbursement procedure, obviously. Keys Energy in southern Florida still has a $42 million FEMA filing from Hurricane Irma. However, Key Energy to date, and FEMA's released $15 million to the state so far. Yet Key has only received $1 million of the $42 million that they are owed. And in the meantime, they have to take out loans to make up for those costs. And now they're paying interest on those loans. So the storm is still getting more expensive every day, to the tune of $2,400 every day. It's costing Key Energy. And so my question is there any way we can break this logjam where FEMA gives money to the state, who is then supposed to disperse it to the locals, those with the loss, yet oftentimes what comes back is FEMA says, well, your contract doesn't fit our regulations exactly, so you have to, redraft all these contracts. Well, they fit the state and local contracts regulations when they were drafted. Is there some way we can agree that if they've met the state and local requirements, that they've met federal requirements?
Congressman, I don't know the particulars about this exact issue, but in general, if you receive federal money, you have to file federal purchasing guidelines. I mean, that's in the statute. We encourage recipients of all types of grants, whether it's disaster grants or non-disaster grants, to make sure they follow the rules when they use that money. We pay particular attention to not only following the rules, but documenting along the way what you did to make sure that the state can reimburse you. So this is all by reimbursement. If the state contracted Key Energy to do something, the contract is between the state and Key, and they have the first responsibility to make sure that the paperwork and the contract and all the things are right. We'll reimburse them based on the document they submit. We take a hard look at it because we're concerned about waste, fraud, and abuse, and if there's some irregularity, it may get kicked back. But I'd be happy to look into the details of this. I mean, I just don't know.
Why these contracts that are, why can't they be accepted? Number one. But let me ask you another question too, because another issue that we have is, these cities for debris removal particularly, well, enter into a contract with a provider for that removal. Yet when so they give a pretty good price, per ton of debris. Yet when the storm hits, they get a price from somebody in South Florida for twice as much as that contract. They pull all their people out of that contract area and they go south to wherever that other location is and make twice the money. Somehow, we need FEMA to help us hold these people accountable for the contracts that they have. Do you have any recommendations on how we might be able to address that issue?
Yes, sir. So first, debris, the debris mission, there is a lot of money in debris, and the bigger the disaster, the more money there is, and it can be pretty competitive.
Right.
There's not many major debris contractors around the country can perform large-scale missions, and so they probably look for the top dollar. What we advocate for state and locals to have pre-disaster contracts, have a contract with some of these vendors or service providers.
Contracts
or
are worthless, though.
Well,
because they leave you and go elsewhere.
I'm not sure what we can do about that. I'm just saying the best practice is we're trying to convince and encourage state directors, local directors to have these pre-disaster contracts. Better to have a contract than to have no contract at all. I'd rather be on their list than not on their list. I'm not sure.
Maybe they can't get FEMA dollars if they violate a contract. That'd be a great idea. And let me close with this real quick because I know my time's running out. On your sustained whole community logistics operation, I know that for Irma, there was an amazing amount of pre-positioning of goods for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands in Jacksonville particularly by Crowley and Tote, two of our Jones Act maritime vessels. That worked exceptionally well. As soon as the port opened, those goods and services were pouring into Puerto Rico there in San Juan. The problem was distribution throughout the country, because of roads and bridges. Was FEMA actually part of that staging, or did they do that on their own?
I can't speak to the exact specifics of that storm. I'll tell you what we have. We have a very robust logistics capability within FEMA. Food, water, generators, tarps, you name it, we have it.
It was very impressive. If you guys were part of it, I don't know.
I would like to think that we were part of it. And again, I'll go back to my local and state director hat. The hardest part of getting those, whether it's a bottle of water or an MRE into a hand of a survivor, is that last mile. That is the hardest part.
That's the hardest part.
And, we are built on locally executed, state managed and fairly supported. So if the local is broken and the state is broken, it comes to us.
Yeah.
Right?
Thank you. My time is.
Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Welcome, Administrator. I come from a state that's had many disasters in recent years, and we're having recovery. We're undertaking recovery efforts now, and appreciate FEMA's cooperation. It's been a good relationship, and we, of course, wanted to continue. And one question that has arisen I want to raise specifically with you today, which has to do with the STEP program. That's a program funded jointly by the state and FEMA, and what it is aimed at is residents who might, with some temporary repairs, continue to live in their homes while the longer-term repairs are being made. That's a good idea for them. It keeps them in the community, keeps them able to work and so on, and it also saves the government money and resources, not having to put people in congregate shelters and hotel rooms and other disaster housing. Now, I know FEMA hasn't standardized the STEP program across the states, and so there is a certain lack of predictability that makes the program difficult to administer for emergency management officials. At least that's been the experience in our state. For example, we were denied a recent extension request and given an April 22nd, 2019 deadline to complete STEP repairs on between 3,000 and 4,000 homes, mind you, hit by Hurricanes Florence and Michael last fall. I'm sure you know Hurricane Florence was the nation's second wettest storm in 70 years. It killed 31 people. It caused an estimated $17 billion in damage. Our emergency officials, believe me, are making good progress on the STEP program. But the sheer magnitude of the hurricanes that hit our state have to be considered, or at least we think they should be considered. So I'll ask you a couple of questions in light of this experience. First, can you explain your process for determining the length of time states have to implement their STEP program? And secondly, what factors do you consider when a state needs an extension and applies for one?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. This goes back to, I think, the original housing question. Post-disaster housing is a problem. It would be our preference to keep people in their homes, and I think that's why we created the STEP program. It's relatively new. We're using it in Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands to great success. On this very issue, I talked to Governor Cooper last week about this extension, and I heard him loud and clear about why he needs it, and so we're going to reevaluate the program. Typically, it runs 180 days. We're going to look at it again, and hopefully we resolve it to everyone's satisfaction.
Good. I appreciate that. Is there anything in the interim? Maybe I should just take that as a good answer and leave it at that. What are the questions you're dealing with here as you consider how to deal with extension requests?
Again, I think each disaster is uniquely different. Some jurisdictions are more capable than others. Weather gets in the way of repairs. I think we're experiencing this out on USVI and Puerto Rico. Weather gets in the way of repairs, and it's out of the applicant's control. So we take all that into consideration. you know, we're trying to assess our risk, making sure that we spend the money correctly within the statute that directs it. All those go into making hopefully a good, reasonable decision that benefits both parties.
Thank you. Thank you. That sounds like a good approach. Secondly, I want to ask you about the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2019. I was pleased when the Congress passed the Disaster Recovery Reform Act last year, the first comprehensive emergency management reform package since Hurricane Katrina. The law included a number of reforms that should be very helpful to North Carolina and other states hit by disasters, especially some of the changes made to the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. The DRRA established new rates for the program and expanded the definition of allowable management costs, and that's what I want to focus on. Can you please tell me when FEMA will release the new management cost guidance? And I also understand FEMA is working to implement this policy with the goal of having a system to allow states to submit applications for management costs by early 2019. Can you please share a time frame for when you expect to have the grant management system fully functional?
Yes, sir. Like I said in my opening statement, we believe DER is transformational in building a more resilient nation. I think the hazard mitigation 6% based on a disaster is going to be groundbreaking to actually invest those dollars pre-disaster. When it comes to management costs, we're trying to work through the 49 unique sections in that act. We actually had a meeting a couple weeks ago with congressional staffers on our progress. I like to think we're making great progress on many of the sections. I don't know the exact status of the management cost section, but I'd be happy to follow up with you on that, on where we are. But overall, I think we're in a positive trend to get some of those DURA sections on the street and implemented.
Let me just say, Madam Chairman, just to respond to that we would appreciate that that material on those time frames. That'll be very helpful.
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Gaynor, for being here today. And I agree, you started off saying sometimes it's the local and state solutions are the best fit for communities, because all states and communities are different, and those are the professionals on the ground, and and one size doesn't always fit all, especially if it's coming from this city. I'd like to first start out by thanking you for the 12 storm shelters that FEMA has provided to Forest County and the state of Mississippi. It's we attract tornadoes, hurricanes, ice storms, you name it, we get it. And I want to thank FEMA, especially the Hazard Mitigation Program grant, for that. I know the supervisors in the community are especially appreciative of that, because if we could save one life, it's really much worth it. I'd like to shift to something. In about 60 days, NFIP is going to expire again. And I don't know how many times it's expired since we reauthorized it. I know in 2013, the Biggert Waters Act was introduced, and soon thereafter, when communities all across the nation started to realize that their rates were not only just going to go up $25, $30, but thousands, and in some cases tens of thousands of dollars on the homeowners' flood insurance policies, we kind of stepped in and realized that, in fact, the author of the bill, Congresswoman Waters, said the unintended consequence was these drastic rate increases. I'm continuously nervous about if any reforms that we make to the flood insurance program that we get it wrong again. And if people if they have a mortgage and they're required to have flood insurance and they can no longer afford the flood insurance, that home can be deemed insecure, and the banks are therefore forced to basically begin taking back that property to protect their asset. I do think there are reforms that can be made to the NFIP program, but this is a program that Congress created in 1968, and I'm concerned that when you're messing with people's largest single investment, which is their home, we got to be very cautious. We got to be very studious on how we approach this, and And I do appreciate what we've done. Some of the past actions, some of the reforms weren't good. I know we're trying to inject the private market. At the same time, we're tossing out terms like we need to make the program actuarially sound. Well, that all sounds well and good, but we also got to protect our homeowners. And we do have a homeowners protection caucus that was created as a result of Biggert Waters. I'm one of the co-chairs. And I would like to ask you, are you seeing is the efforts of privatization, the private market entering into the flood insurance market, is that taking place? And if so, what do we do to prevent the private companies from cherry picking, taking the most safe policies and undercutting the government NFIP rate, and then leaving all the more unsafe properties in reduced premium pool with probably higher and more increasing rates? That's just a concern of mine, and that was a concern of many of my colleagues when we made sure we killed the last NFIP reform bill.
All great questions, Congressman. First, at FEMA, we believe an insured home is a valuable home. To answer your first question, how many extensions has NFIP had? 42. It is time for some reform. We believe that. This past year, these past 2 years, we added about 200,000 new policies. I think part of the issue with NFIP is when it comes to giving insurance policies, we are the only insurer in those locations. There is no other insurers to divide that risk up into. So when there's a disaster that requires NFIP, it really hits hard. 1 inch of water in a home is worth $25,000 worth of damage. If you go back and look at some of the past disasters, having insurance and not having insurance. So FEMA gives individual assistance. You can get up to $35,000 of assistance if you meet all the different wickets. On average, we only give out about $2,600. But if you look at insurance, what we've given out for the same kind of damage, you get $109,000. So, we'd rather have insured homes because first of all, insurance pays first, but it's better for everyone. FEMA will not make you whole. FEMA is a bridge to get you to the next, safe, warm, and dry location. But we're not going to make you whole. So insurance is infinitely important for us. Last 2017, we bought a reinsurance for NFIP, and we saved the taxpayers $1 billion. And I think we're going to try to do that again. So we're all in on making sure we try to rethink flood insurance because it rains in every state, right? It floods in every state. So this is just not, I live next to the stream. You look at Houston, it flooded where, it had never flooded before. So, again, an insured home is a valuable home.
And we've seen this with a lot of the storm events over the past several years, Madam Chairwoman, where, the rivers never flooded out the communities. It just seems to be happening more and more. And that's why perhaps in the second round of questions, I'll ask you about all perils insurance as well.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Administrator, for being here today. Wanted to ask about language access issues. During and after a disaster, language access has often been an issue for limited English proficient individuals, including and especially those of the Asian American and Pacific Islanders community. As evident from Hurricane Katrina, FEMA wasn't equipped to communicate with the Vietnamese American community then in New Orleans. When Hurricane Harvey hit, API organizations such as API Vote had to step in to translate information that FEMA officials were releasing because it was only available in English and Spanish. Hurricane Katrina occurred in 2005, Harvey in 2017, which is about 12 years. What had FEMA done in between to improve language access since Katrina?
Ma'am, I think we recognize that making sure we get our message out to the entire community is important. I can't speak to the specifics of what we've done to improve that. I'll get back to you on that, but I'll just use if the U.S. military can have a piece of technology in their hand to translate, it would seem that we could do the same thing for meeting survivors in a disaster area. So, but I'd be happy to get you some information about our strides in that and what we're doing and maybe what we plan to do.
Okay, yes, I would love to work with you to make sure that we're working with organizations around the country and to help you and FEMA do good as a job as possible. My other question is, there were reports in the media that following President Trump's public declaration, he wanted no more disaster funds going to Puerto Rico, and that administration officials started telling agencies, HUD specifically at the time, to block money appropriated by Congress for Puerto Rico. Do you have any direct or indirect knowledge of any actions taken by the Trump administration to block disaster recovery money from going to Puerto Rico?
Ma'am, what I do know is that the approved disaster money through disaster process is how we deliver services to those impacted. Other conversations with HUD I'm not familiar with, but we have money appropriated through the process, and we're using that to deliver the best disaster relief to our survivors.
So as far as you're concerned, you don't have any knowledge of those actions taken by the Trump administration?
I do not.
Do you or your team staff have any knowledge of any communications made with the Trump administration in the same topic?
I do not, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you. And then back to, sorry. So I know that in July, FEMA issued an after-action report assessing its response to the 2017 storm season. This report included recommendations to address staffing needs, increase FEMA readiness stocks outside the continental U.S., etc. What actions has FEMA taken to meet these recommendations?
When it comes to what we call the CAD, or the Caribbean Area Division, is how we manage the Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. We have done significant work and to make sure that we have commodities on island. Between the islands of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, we have now 8 warehouses full of commodities on island, and more commodities stateside that we can tap into. So we're trying to learn our lessons from Maria and making sure that we don't repeat that again, but we've taken significant steps to improve our commodities.
And that would help get supplies out to people around an island more efficiently than had happened after Maria.
That would be the theory. That, again, I think the hardest part for a local emergency manager, state emergency manager, is that last mile. Right? You can have it, but you have to transport it. You have to get it in the hands of the survivors. So the last mile is the hardest mile. But there's adequate resources and commodities on the islands for a disaster.
Thank you. I will back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a quick question that is more locally focused. According to NOAA, Hurricane Irma was the strongest hurricane ever observed in the open Atlantic Ocean. After barreling through Florida, 6.5 million customers in my state were left without power, and the winds, rain, and flooding left a trail of destruction and debris. Memorial Healthcare System, a safety net provider which operates 6 hospitals in South Florida, including a level 1 trauma center, which is headquartered in my district, cleaned up the mess around its facilities, spent money on clearing road debris, extra labor, and mitigation. However, 15 months after their initial application with FEMA, with a total reimbursement request of approximately $7 million, Memorial Healthcare has received not $1. Mr. Gaynor, you discussed in your testimony the actions that FEMA is taking to consolidate and update your individual assistance policies. But what is FEMA doing to simplify and streamline the process for reimbursements for emergency healthcare providers like Memorial? Because 15 months is far too long, far longer than is reasonable to expect them to have to wait.
Yes, ma'am. Again, I don't have the exact details of the Memorial Health issue. I'd be happy to look into that and see why it's taken so long. Again, I'll just go back to Each disaster is very unique,
My question specifically is, what is FEMA doing to simplify and streamline the process for reimbursements for emergency health care providers like Memorial? I certainly am familiar with the complexity of dealing with the aftermath of a storm since I live in South Florida.
Yes, ma'am. We have implemented the grants management system. Or I should say, part of the new public assistance delivery is to better account for paperwork, track reimbursements, make sure the paperwork is all correct before we go down a long road and decide that something is missing early on in the process and has to go back again and back again. I think this is part of the frustration with local and states, that we get to the end and we realize that something's missing. So this new PA policy project and GMM to track all that is our initiative to make sure that we try to speed it as long as we can. Again, it can be complicated in certain circumstances, but our goal is to deliver the fastest relief to our survivors.
I'll be honest with you, your response doesn't really give me a lot of confidence that you've got a system in place that is headed towards improving this situation. FEMA was plagued with contracting problems following the 2017 disaster season. In October of 2017, FEMA terminated a contract after just 20 days with Tribute Contracting, which was supposed to deliver 30 million meals in Puerto Rico. The contract was reportedly worth $156 million. Tribute delivered only 50,000 of the 30 million meals it was supposed to. According to media reports, Tribute was a single-employee business with no large-scale disaster contracting experience and had already been barred from contracts with the Government Publishing Office when FEMA entered into its contract with the company. Similarly, FEMA had to cancel a $30 million contract for tarps, or plastic sheeting, when a newly formed company called Bronze Star failed to deliver the urgently needed supplies. Mr. Gaynor, in the aftermath of these failed contracts for supplies that can mean life or death for disaster survivors, what steps has FEMA taken to make certain that it only contracts for goods and services with companies that actually have the capacity to perform? And do you look to see if a company has been deemed ineligible for contracts with other government agencies before you contract with them?
Ma'am, so to your point about the contracts, we executed for Maria approximately 2,000 contracts. Of those 2,000 contracts, 3 of those contracts failed to work, and we just cut them off at no expense to the federal government. The Tribute contract, they supplied, I'm going to say 50,000 meals at about $250,000. We got the food, we paid them, and then we ended the contract.
Okay, but what are you doing to make sure that grave, gross mistakes like that don't happen again?
So we've increased our cap on contracts to make sure we have more capacity among the contracts that we do have. And we have plenty of commodity contracts available. So if one...
Okay, I'm sorry. Before my time expires, I just have one more. Following Hurricane Irma, then Florida Governor Rick Scott's office overrode pre-negotiated debris removal contracts and entered into debris removal contracts at extraordinarily inflated prices. Specifically, Governor Scott's office signed contracts in Monroe County that raised significant concerns about potential waste and fraud. What consequences are there, piggybacking on what Congressman Rutherford asked you, what consequences are for this kind of waste, fraud, and abuse practices? I mean, it doesn't make, your response, frankly, to his question doesn't make any sense to me. You throw up your hands and you just say there's very little you can do. You control hundreds of millions of dollars in reimbursements, and you can certainly put in place accountability practices that ensure that when rules are broken, when policies are violated, that you prohibit reimbursement from particular entities in the future. Do you not have any policies like that in place?
We do, ma'am. We use, for instance, the 270 policy in Puerto Rico, oversight on how a state spends its money. Manual drawdown, that they can't draw money down until we approve it. There's many different controls that we have. I am not familiar with the Florida issue with Governor Scott before my time. I'd be happy to look into it. I'm not sure if we did anything, what actions we took. I just don't know, but I'm happy to get back with you with an answer on that.
I would appreciate that. Thank you. You're back.
And now we are honored to have the chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. Lowy.
Well, I appreciate the honor. I do wish I had roller skates on today, but I'm happy to be here. I am so sorry that I missed so much of the meeting, but welcome. And I appreciate the opportunity to have a discussion with you. In the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, Governor Cuomo directed New York State entities to provide assistance to Puerto Rico, including assistance provided by New York Electric Utilities to repair the electric grid. This effort was coordinated by the New York Power Authority, which happens to have headquarters in my district. NYPA's efforts are an example of mutual aid, where state and local governments provide assistance to each other in the aftermath of a disaster. It's my understanding that the New York Power Authority is continuing this partnership to provide assistance not only to Puerto Rico, but also to the U.S. Virgin Islands before, during, and after disasters. Can you help me understand how this type of mutual aid supports FEMA's efforts? And is there anything we can do in Congress to better support and facilitate mutual aid?
Thank you, ma'am. Thanks for inviting me today. EMAC, the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, is a state-to-state agreement between governors to exchange staff, equipment, commodities during a disaster. So a governor can ask another disaster for help. It is one of the core things that we rely on at FEMA, kind of a first-level ask before you ask the federal government. You know, do you have it within your state? Can you get it from one of your neighbors? Can you get it from across the country? And it really is a core of how we do good emergency management in the United States. Specifically for the Puerto Rico ask, there were 92 EMAC requests fulfilled by 27 states. Pretty amazing support from fellow governors in Puerto Rico's worst time. I think it's a shining star, I think, on neighbor helping neighbor in this case, to make sure that you have all the necessary things that you need to deliver, you know, survivors whether it's commodities or police, fire, all those resources went to Puerto Rico, and probably some deficit to a state that let it go and didn't have access to it. So again, this business of emergency management is a team effort. So from state to state, from our private partners, from our volunteers, from other emergency management across the nation, it has to be a team. No one person has all the capability to do it themselves, and we could not be successful without it. What you could do, I'm not exactly sure. I think EMAC works pretty well. I know the National Guard has some issues with how they get repaid. I don't know the exact details of it, but I'd be happy to see what we can do to improve that.
Good. Are there many other of these helpers, of these states that were sending supplies? Are they still involved, or have they all gone home?
I don't know if any states are still down there. I can check. I would imagine that most of those resources are going home, but I'll check.
I just wondered. Now, as you know, to carry out its programs, FEMA, as well as state, territorial, and local governments, rely on contractors. Recently, the Washington Post highlighted issues with payments to contractors for the Sheltering and Temporary Essential Power, or STEP program, in the U.S. Virgin Islands. This program provides critical assistance to residents making repairs to their homes, and we understand that it is also being used in Puerto Rico. The contractors described in the Washington Post article work under a contract with the U.S. Virgin Islands, but they cannot be paid until FEMA approves project worksheets for work they have done, nearly a year and a half after these hurricanes. Now, we understand that the U.S. Virgin Islands made a request for the funding in question in fall of 2018. Now, I understand this is a complex situation. Can you tell me how much funding is currently pending for the STEP program in the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico? And what is the status of the project worksheets? Are the project worksheets related to Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands taking longer than usual? And if so, why?
Yes, ma'am. So when it comes to U.S. Virgin Islands and this STEP program, which is a success in Puerto Rico. We did 110,000 homes in STEP. We hoped, we won't do that many homes, but we hope to have that great kind of success in USVI. And this, as I understand, is in two parts. The first part of the STEP program, USVI, was completed. We reimbursed the Virgin Islands with $180 million for that program. They have drawn down some of the money, but they still have some money that they have not drawn down, which they could use to pay contractors, approximately $60 million that is still left. The second phase is really aimed at roofs in USVI. That project worksheet is called Project Worksheet 100, is with USVI right now, and they're trying to validate some of the costs in there. As soon as we get that back at headquarters, we'll turn it around and we will make sure that we properly fund that and reimburse that project worksheet.
So the time frame is how long from delivery till you can approve it?
So as soon as just for context, everything over $5 million has to go to the Department, Homeland Security, and OMB for a review. So we can get it out the door pretty fast if it's all in order, and then we send it to the Department for review, and then OMB for final review, and then we'll transfer that money. I can't tell you how long that's going to take. I think when we get it back from them, we'll have a better timeline. But I'd love to keep you updated on where we are on that.
I'd appreciate an update, and I'm wondering, is this typical? That kind of, roughly how much time does this process take?
The scale of Maria is mind-boggling, how much money that we're trying to deliver. Billions of dollars in both Puerto Rico and U.S. Virgin Islands. This is a project worksheet of $278 million. This is a large worksheet. Typically, they're not that size, so it just takes longer because it's just more complex. But that doesn't mean it has to be slow.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
That concludes round one, and so we'll start a second round of questioning. Mr. Gaynor, Section 20601 of the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 gave FEMA flexibility to make repairs or replace certain types of facilities to industry standards, regardless of their pre-disaster condition for disasters in Puerto Rico. We have heard from the Commonwealth government and others that FEMA is implementing this authority in a manner that appears to be much more limited than Congress intended, with the potential result that few projects will fully benefit from this authority. Can you explain FEMA's interpretation of this legislation and why there is a sense that this is not being carried out as intended?
Thank you, ma'am. First, I think we want to thank you from FEMA for passing the BBA, as it's known. It really allows us to do things that we could not do before in any disaster. The rules pre-BBA require that we only could restore to pre-disaster conditions. As you well know, in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, that is not the case. So this allows us to restore to industry standard. So thank you for that. And our goal in both Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands is to build it back better. We believe that we are implementing BBA with the congressional intent. However, we have pre-existing other statutes, Stafford Act statutes, that we're trying to blend to make sure we get it right the first time. I was in Puerto Rico a couple weeks ago and met with our Puerto Rican counterparts, Core 3, and I think we're in agreement with more than less. We're still in disagreement about what BBA looks for certain projects. I think on one end of the scale, one can interpret that BBA says everything is brand new. And so maybe, on the other end of the scale, maybe it's just a repair. So we're trying to come to some common ground about how we resolve that. We are full partners with the government of Puerto Rico on this. I don't think this is really going to be a stumbling block as we move forward. Again, some of these projects are so large, it just takes time to get through it. But I think we're in agreement more than we're not.
Okay. Do you think that these issues can be addressed administratively by FEMA, or is additional legislation needed to reinforce congressional?
No, I think we have all that we need. I think now we're just trying to get down to the, does it need a new, so for schools, for instance, so if a school is completely destroyed, the roof is in, well, maybe you need a new school. But if you go to a different school, and there's 1,100 of those schools on Puerto Rico, if you go to a different school, and maybe the front door and the windows are blown out, now, does that rate a new school? Again, we want to be good stewards of the federal dollar. So we're having these discussions about, how to get to yes.
Okay, I understand that this authority is limited to critical services, which is a specific term in the Stafford Act that refers to facilities such as you mentioned, schools and utilities, but not others such as police or fire facilities. Do you think an expansion of this authority to additional types of facilities is warranted? And if not, why not?
I'm not sure how far we are on discussion on some of these issues. I have to get details about some of these issues and questions about, will we get the yes on some of those? But I'm happy to get back to you about the status of that. Again, I think we're closer to the yes than not.
Okay. The Commonwealth government has expressed concerns that the 270 process imposed by FEMA has been a cause of delay in disbursing disaster funds, thereby delaying projects. And we understand that this is a manual validation of costs and documentation. We have also heard that FEMA and Puerto Rico have just reached an agreement to have the Commonwealth take over this process. Can you explain what the 270 process is, its purpose, and how it works?
So pre-removal from Puerto Rico was a process where we looked at all the paperwork to make sure it's in order. We had some problems early on in the disaster where an entity drew down money without proper documentation. So typically, you would have to show invoices for material, supplies, labor costs, all those kind of things before we actually let you take that money from the Treasury. And so we put restrictions on it because we're allowed to do that to make sure, again, we don't want to, or we want to make sure we do proper due diligence on this funds. We've been working with the government for a year on their internal control process. We agreed on that last week, and we removed all the controls. So now the government will have the first shot at reviewing all their paperwork. We'll sample that as we go to make sure they're doing all the things we want to do. If we think the risk becomes too high, we have the option to go back to 270. I don't think we'll have to do that. I think we're going in the right direction, and I think this is good for both Puerto Rico and FEMA.
So you expect then that this will improve the pace of recovery?
I do.
Puerto Rico?
I do. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and Acting Administrator Gaynor, I really appreciate the lines of questioning. It's been very informative for me and for us. Thank you, sir. I'm intrigued, sir, by the idea of working with your local partners to improve local capacity to deal with smaller scale disasters. How do you define smaller scale, sir?
That's in the eye of the beholder, is small. So I come from the smallest state in the Union, Rhode Island. We're just a average size county in Texas. So what's big for Rhode Island is not so big for Texas. And this is I think this is part of our challenge, to get it, to right size it, to make sure that we, don't create the California size, and we don't create the Rhode Island size. We create the size that works for everyone. Again, having been a local and state emergency manager, there are some obligations to make sure that you, as a local emergency manager, can execute the plan for your mayor, and as a state director, that you can execute your plan for the governor. As the FEMA director, I'm making sure that I can execute the plan for the president. But the whole system has to work together. It is just not FEMA. A bigger FEMA is not the answer. It is all of us working together to a common cause.
What would be the incentive for a locality to take on the responsibility for response and recovery?
I would ask, again with my local hat on, would I want to manage my own disaster, or would I want the federal government to manage my disaster? I think I would rather chart my own course. So we would, I think, conceptually, depending on what size is, and again, 50% of all disasters are under $7 million, we could just block grant the agreed upon disaster cost to a local, and they would manage it under all the federal rules and regulations, and they would be responsible for their what we call now is outcome-driven recovery, their recovery, not necessarily our recovery. And just as a, this is the governor's plan for his recovery. We support the governor's plan. We don't implement a federal plan at the local or the state. Again, I think it's just good business.
Thank you, sir. The FEMA integration teams, or FITs, are in 16 states. I would ask you to kindly provide the committee with a copy of the 16 states that are participating. Yeah. Does FEMA approach the states to participate, or do they come to you all?
It's a little bit of both. I think at first when Administrator Long was trying to sell this program, we had to go out there and sell it a little bit. Right now, there are 16 active FIT teams. All 50 states and territories have signed up for FIT teams, and we're trying to meet that goal. And part of the goodness in this FIT team is typically you only see the federal government when a disaster occurs, and that is not a good time. So we want to embed our FEMA team to make sure that the plans and the processes are integrated from state to federal and from state to local, and those FIT teams are there. They act as consultants for the state when it comes to federal programs to make it more streamlined. There's a lot of goodness in FIT teams, and we fully support them.
Yes, sir. Does FEMA assume the cost of the teams, and how long does the team stay with the state?
It is. It comes out. We just realigned what kind of people we assign there. So it comes out of Hyde, basically. So we're doing without something else, but I think this is more valuable to the agencies to have these FIT teams in these states.
Thank you, sir. Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Yes, sir. Great question. Part of the difficulty is some of these repetitive issues. You have a home, you have a disaster or a flood, you get money from the federal government, you rebuild it in the same place. That happens a couple times. It doesn't really make a lot of sense for us. The challenge is most of these changes are local code changes that locals really own their own domain. So whether it's a city or town or a state, building codes, zoning codes, it really has to start with them. I think we can try to pressure best practice, and there's some great best practices around the country, but it really has to start locally. We would prefer not to keep paying for the same disaster over and over and over. To me, that's insanity. And so we need to work a little bit harder on making sure that locals have a program to make sure that they build in a resilient way so you avoid that risk. I'll have to check my facts, but I think if you use hazard mitigation money for a repair and it happens again, I'm going to, and I may be half right on this, that you're prohibited from using that again, I think, for a repetitive disaster. So you would have to do something to actually improve that property to make it more resilient before you got another, another disaster handout.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jumping over, being from Biloxi, Mississippi, living my entire life on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, of course, I hear a lot of references to Hurricane Katrina. I think that was the first bad storm to have hit America, and it was unprecedented, and I think the level of the storm since then are matching, in some cases maybe exceeding the severity of that storm, but that's pretty much a benchmark storm. And I don't know, but where would I go to find the best practices for FEMA? I do know several years after Hurricane Katrina, we were in Congress, and I was asking questions. It's like, how are we making the same mistakes that FEMA made during Hurricane Katrina? It might not have been mistakes; it might have been lessons learned, because it was such a disastrous storm. Is there a repository for best practices? So I'm assuming we're sharing them with the local EMAs and the state EMAs and things of that nature. And where can I find those?
We do have a great repository of lessons learned from DHS on down. And we want to be smarter about how we, and if we're thinking about recovery, the legacy of Katrina, and I'll give you some context. This week, over the past 6 months, we found out this week that we're still spending money 13 years later for recovery at the tune of, for this particular project worksheet, $4.5 million for disaster recovery 13 years ago. What we want to do is not do actual cost anymore. We want to do fixed costs, and this is what 428 alternate procedures is about. This is how business is done in America. You want something done, I give you a price, I perform the work, I get paid. Legacy recovery is not that way. It's actual costs, and if you have no incentive to move faster or move smarter, 13 years later, you're still paying on a disaster. We just need to change the way we do this recovery. But I'd be happy to supply in a tangible way all the after-action resources that we have.
I know after Hurricane Camille, there was actually a congressional report produced on the recovery efforts by the federal government. I think I lost those during Katrina, but maybe I can get a set from the Library of Congress or someplace, archives. Now, obviously, Mississippi is grateful for the financial assistance post-Katrina recovery to a tune of over $3-point-something billion. We would not have been able to recover as near as well as we have. And our whole mindset was not to just build back, but build forward. Mitigate it against future storms and be smart with the money, because we knew it was a gift from the federal government and the American people. So please trust me. I mean, we are extremely grateful to everyone that supported our recovery. Now, I do have something that's been some concerns have been popping up lately, is that FEMA is kind of like second guessing years after the work has been done. They're asking for money to be returned, and I know continuously there's been a lot of turnover amongst FEMA staff. So there may have been a FEMA project director on site in 2007. Work may have been done, and then in 2013, someone's looking at the paperwork and saying, "Well, why'd they do this? That's not right." But at the time, we feel like some of these projects where, we followed FEMA's guidance, we did it to the T, we did exactly what they want, and now they're kind of being unfair, changing the rules after the money's been expended and spent, and asking for it back. Is that something that you're seeing or hearing from other maybe storms, and what can we do to alleviate that? Because there's got to be some documentation say, yeah, we approved it. We can't go back 10 years later and say, hey, city, you owe us, $30 million because we don't think you spent it right. Second guessing what was done during the initial recovery.
So I have personal knowledge of this as a state director, the FEMA trying to take money back from the state. So I know the pain of that. And this goes to the legacy of how we did recovery. If you can imagine, if you start a project in 2007 and it doesn't close out until 2014, and you have all that paperwork that you have to go through to actually get reimbursed, it can be an impossible task. What we have done, learned from those lessons learned, is what we've implemented in across the country, but specifically in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, is validate as you go, right? So, maybe there's a big payment that happens, take all that work that was done, all that paperwork, all those forms, and validate it, and call it closed. And then we'll never go back to that. And then we'll move on to the next chunk. So it's a new program. I think it's going to prevent clawbacks in the future. That's what we call it, a clawback. We want to avoid that because it's not good for us and it's not good for the community that was impacted by the disaster.
Well, thank you. And Madam Chair, I don't know how much time I have, but can I just ask one quick question in terms of Puerto Rico? You know, I've heard from several people on the island that they would like to see the Category A bucket extended because there's so much more work to be done. And we know if we go to the increased or the local match, Puerto Rico just doesn't have the money. Can you tell me a little bit about Category A? Is there a chance that it will be extended? And just your thoughts on that.
Recovery is difficult. And we found that recovery happens best when all partners, and specifically the government, so whether it's a state government or the Commonwealth, has skin in the game, where you use your local or state dollars to contribute to the end result. And we're calling it outcome-driven recovery. So when you have incentive, and this goes to the actual cost and the fixed cost. So if you have a fixed cost, we believe that you have more incentive to do it faster. If you have actual costs, no skin in the game, you're just going to hand the bill to the federal government. It goes on forever and ever and ever. I think the administration gave Puerto Rico a lot of time on categories A and B. I want to say 8 months. And I think the 10% share that they have is well within their means to fulfill. They can use HUD money. It's actually in this plan on how to make up that 10%. So we think it's reasonable. We think it's going to achieve a faster outcome when the state or the Commonwealth has skin in the game and invest their own dollars in it. Without it, it just keeps going on and on and on.
Mr. Gaynor, thank you. Thank you for your public service, and thank you for being here today. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Welcome. We have just a little bit more time for either additional question or some comments. So I do have one last question. In 2017, FEMA implemented the new delivery model to administer the public assistance program, and it's been used in most of the recent disasters since then, including, for example, in Los Angeles County. However, it is not being implemented in Puerto Rico or the U.S. Virgin Islands. Can you briefly explain what this new delivery model is and why it was not used in Puerto Rico or the U.S. Virgin Islands?
Yes, ma'am. I think we're not using it in there because it was a pilot program, and by the time we got it online, we had already started the traditional process in Puerto Rico, and to go back, from what I understand, it was going to be too difficult, too time-consuming, and really will not get us to the end result faster. So it's just really a way to make sure you account for all those things that you do in recovery in a systematic way, using technology to track all that. We're using it in other places around the country. We're just not using it in Puerto Rico because it just didn't, again, it was a pilot and it wasn't really ready for prime time. And so we just said, let's not make our life more complicated. Let's just go with what we know, and then we'll put that program throughout the country at other opportunities.
So have you had time to assess this new delivery model, and if so, can you share any results?
Only anecdotally, I think positive results. One of my former state directors in Massachusetts gave us a demonstration on it. I think it was very positively received. It's been a few years now since I've got an update on that, but I'd be happy to go back and see where we are on that uptake and what the customer satisfaction rate is on that. I'd be interested myself to see how we're doing.
Okay, I'd appreciate it. Any further questions or comments? If not,
I could go on for hours.
Okay. Okay. The subcommittee's adjourned.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.